Díomh. A ara agus a gcuine úsle, ambassadori, Mick agus Furin UCD. Grim fáilte roamh chuig an óráid speisialta seo ón ara Simon Coveney, an órap atá ag tasáil uing. Ladies and gentlemen, Minister, Your Excellencies, colleagues and friends of UCD. My name is Orla Feely. I'm UCD Vice President for Research, Innovation and Impact, and it's an enormous pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to University College Dublin for Minister Simon Coveney's keynote address entitled The Europe We Want. After his address, the Minister will be taking some questions on his speech. Earlier this month, the Minister, together with the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar and Minister Helen McEntee, launched a citizens' dialogue on the future of Europe as part of a wider debate now underway across Europe on how best we can address the challenges of a rapidly changing world. This evening's address by Minister Coveney forms part of this dialogue initiative. Just as Irish society and the Irish economy has been transformed by our involvement with Europe, so too has higher education and so too has this university. I was a student, an engineering student in UCD in what is now government buildings back in the 1980s, and I recall very well how our more progressive lecturers at the time started to bring in this exotic European research funding, and it transformed the activity that we could support, it transformed our networks, it transformed our ambition around research. At around the same time, through the wonders of the Erasmus programme, our students started to travel in very large and structured ways around Europe, and we started to welcome European students in to our university here. This was really the first big step in what has become the great global success story of UCD's internationalisation. So for so many reasons, we have benefited from Europe in our infrastructure, in our research networks, in our student mobility, in our staff mobility, in our networks. But we are not passive beneficiaries of the European project. UCD, our scholars, our graduates are out there at the forefront of European debate, shaping the Europe that we believe we deserve. We are in the building here today named after one of our most distinguished graduates, one of our most distinguished Europeans, and we have another of our most distinguished graduates moderating today's discussion, and we very much welcome her, and I'll introduce her in a moment. So once again, Minister, we are delighted to have you here. I think it is very appropriate that you are launching this dialogue in a university. We have very many students here this evening, and I know you were particularly keen that they should be here. We know that they have a particular stake in a dynamic and progressive Europe. We know that Irish interest in matters European is particularly acute at this time, just as is interest in Europe in matters to do with Ireland. So it is very important that we hold this dialogue, not just looking at the challenges of today, and we are very aware of the dialogue that is taking place today, but the dialogue of tomorrow, of a decade, of several decades from now. What is the shape of the Europe that we want? So our moderator then today is Catherine Day. Delighted to welcome Catherine, who is, again, as I say, a hugely distinguished graduate of UCD and of Mount Anville School, having grown up in Mount Merion. She graduated with a BA in Economics and an MA in International Trade and Economic Integration from UCD, and received an honorary doctorate in law from the university in 2004. In 2015, then, she received the UCD Foundation Day Medal in recognition of her outstanding impact on the European Union. Catherine joined the European Commission in 1979, having worked in the Investment Bank of Ireland and the Confederation of Irish Industry. Starting in the Industry DG, she worked in the cabinets of 3 commissioners from 1982 to 1996, first with Richard Burke, next with Peter Sutherland, and then with Sir Leon Britton, whom she served as Deputy Head of Cabinet. She returned to work for Leon Britton in 1996 as Director for Relations with Third World Countries. In 2000, she was appointed as Deputy Director General in the Directorate General for External Relations under Chris Patton. In 2002, she moved to the Director General for the Environment as Director General. She was appointed Secretary General of the European Commission. This is the senior civil servant of the European Commission in November 2005 by President José Manuel Barroso, and continued to serve with President Jean-Claude Juncker until her retirement in September 2015. So all the major discussions that happened in Europe During that decade, Catherine was there. She was in the room for these discussions. And it is an enormous honour to have her here this evening to introduce the Minister and then to moderate the Q&A afterwards. Catherine, you're very welcome.
Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for that introduction. The length of my career in the Commission, I think you will understand, has given me a lifelong passion and commitment for the European Union, and that's why I'm so pleased to be here today in my old alma mater of UCD. I have to say the campus is looking much better than when I was here in the early development of Belfield in the 1970s. And it gives me great pleasure to be here to introduce this evening the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, Simon Coveney. As Orla said, a few weeks ago, the Minister, together with the Taoiseach and Minister of State, Helen McEntee, launched this debate in Ireland to discuss what kind of EU do we want for the future. We all know that the EU is going through challenging times at the moment. Brexit looms very large, particularly here in Ireland, where it's an enormous subject of debate right across the country every day. But in fact, in most of the other member states, it is more the future of Europe, what happens next, that is higher up on the political agenda. We all know that the EU without the UK will be different, but what kind of different? And so we need to have a debate about what kind of Europe, what kind of EU do we want for the future? Or what kind of EU do we not want? And we need to discuss the sort of policies that this country, as part of its ongoing membership of the EU, wants to contribute to build and to help to shape. And that's what this debate is all about. Tonight, the Minister is going to speak on the theme of the Europe we want, and I think there's no better person to do that. The Minister is proud to call himself a Europhile, and that comes from his experience as a member of the European Parliament, as a minister in several European Council formations, so no better person to know what it's like from the inside, the ups and the downs. But I think the Minister would also be quick to say that he's not an uncritical Europhile. He sees it and tells it like it is. And I think that's exactly the kind of positively constructive debate that we now have to have about Europe. Not about a perfect ideal, but about how 27 sovereign countries get together to solve the problems that they cannot tackle on their own and to improve the well-being of their citizens collectively in a world that is getting more complicated all the time. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask the Minister to come to the podium to deliver his address. As Orla has said, he's happy to take questions afterwards. And I really want to thank the Minister for his personal engagement in this and his personal energy that he brings to the debate. And I hope that you will respond both tonight and in the months to come by getting involved in the debate. We cannot complain afterwards if we're not happy about the way the EU turns out, if we don't bring our individual contributions to the debate. The invitation is there, the government is listening, and I thank you for coming out tonight on a very chilly night to be part of this debate. Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. Professor, ambassadors, in particular, thank you for taking the time to be here this evening with us. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not a coincidence that we wanted to host this initial debate in Ireland's largest university, because we wanted to engage with the next generation of decision makers, if you like, in terms of Ireland's place in Europe and where this common home that we value and support is likely to go in the future, and how Ireland can influence that. When I checked the diary recently, I thought that Tuesday the 28th of November would be a nice politically quiet date on which to share with you my thoughts on Europe. As the British ambassador will know, I spend a lot of time talking about Brexit at the moment. And I think it's a real opportunity tonight to talk about some of the broader European issues. Of course, I can take questions on Brexit if people want me to later. But things don't always work out as you plan. But regardless, this is still an exciting time for Ireland to play a role in shaping Europe's future. And the audience here tonight and the interest in this topic is a very encouraging signal. When we talk of the European Union in Ireland, we often look back to 1973, which is a key date when Ireland joined the then EEC. But tonight I'd like to look back to another date, 1961, when we submitted our first application at the same time as the UK submitted theirs. Our sense of remoteness, even insignificance, at the time was captured by a newspaper report which said, "Europe is as far from Ireland as Ireland is from Europe." A truism that might have been written by the same genius who coined the phrase, "Brexit means Brexit." Brussels acknowledged our application, but gave no word on when negotiations might even begin. The founding six were talking to the UK, but nobody spoke to us. Few in Brussels thought Ireland was sufficiently developed. Some didn't take our application even seriously. Hardly anybody expected a separate application from Ireland at all. When President de Gaulle long-fingered the British application, ours fell too, and it was over a decade before we subsequently joined. Let's fast forward to today. The EU has set out its position on Brexit. There is a strong acknowledgement of Ireland's unique concerns and priorities, including protecting the Good Friday Agreement and the gains of the peace process, avoiding a hard border and maintaining the common travel area with Britain. Brexit is important in most other countries, but it's not always the top of their agendas. Yet whenever we discuss Brexit in Brussels, I'm always struck by the importance my colleagues attach to solving Irish issues with us. They never fail to prioritise our issues and show real solidarity with our concerns. Who could have imagined that Michel Barnier, Europe's chief negotiator, or Guy Verhofstadt, the European Parliament's representative on Brexit negotiations, would have travelled to Louth and Monaghan to see for themselves the potential impact on the Irish border? Or that foreign ministers from Luxembourg, Denmark, Finland would be familiar with places like Jonesborough or Concession Road from Monaghan to Cullaville, because they too wanted to visit what they regard as the most affected potential areas by Brexit. I don't take this attention for granted. The solidarity of our EU partners has been remarkable in the context of these challenges. It refutes the claim that we have no friends after Brexit. We have long-standing alliances with a variety of like-minded countries on issues ranging from agriculture to taxation and the digital single market, or indeed the protection of human rights around the world. We have an embassy in every EU member state. We have strengthened our presence in Brussels, Paris, Berlin and London. And I'll be adding staff to other capitals as we double our diplomatic footprint in the medium term, not only in Europe, but in other parts of the world too. But the solidarity we are witnessing also puts to bed an even bigger lie. People say that each time we pool more of our sovereignty, we lose some of our sovereignty. But what was there to lose? In 1961, we could argue that we were fully sovereign. But the truth is that we were remote, some would say insignificant on international issues, and not taken seriously by those who noticed us, if they noticed us at all. Today, by contrast, we benefit from the solidarity and generosity of other member states that we work together with. Our sovereignty is stronger now than it was at any time before we joined the European Union. We are stronger, undoubtedly, at the heart of this project. The sovereignty issue is important, as polling in the UK suggests that it was the biggest issue for people who voted in the referendum, bigger than, for example, migration, which is often, I think, misunderstood. I'm not arguing tonight for a United States of Europe. Let's be clear on that. The Europe I believe in, and that, in my view, Ireland wants, is a union of sovereign member states working together to tackle the big issues of the day that we simply cannot tackle on our own. Pooling sovereignty, when it makes sense to do so, and when we democratically decide to do so. It's just over 40 years since we joined the EU, and in another 40 years, no single member state will have more than 1% of the world's population. There's only one city in the EU that features in the top 30 cities globally in terms of population, and not for much longer either. This is why we need to stick together. The European Union is the best instrument we have for addressing our new global and domestic challenges. We have to ensure that it has the capacity to play a key role in the world, shaping globalization, tackling climate change, and facing down international terrorism, and aspiring to be a global diplomatic superpower, promoting peace and security globally, which I believe should be the next core project for the European Union internationally. European integration serves Ireland well. The European Union is based on a common set of values, enshrined and protected by treaties. It is one of the most democratic international organisations that exists anywhere on the planet. Ireland alone has 11 directly elected members of the European Parliament. Ireland's Commissioner, Phil Hogan, is responsible for agriculture and rural development, a portfolio that commands almost 40% of the EU's budget. All draft legislation sent to the European Parliament must be sent at the same time to Dáil Éireann and Seanad Éireann. Irish ministers, myself included, attend 10 different formations of councils of ministers each month, handling issues as disparate as foreign affairs, education, transport, agriculture, and so on. The Taoiseach participates in at least 4 meetings of the European Council every year. In Brussels, we have over 70 officials seconded from 11 different government departments, plus the Revenue Commissioners, the Defence Forces, the Attorney General's Office, and indeed the Oireachtas. That's 70 Irish officials negotiating legislation and policy positions on our behalf on a day-to-day basis under the guidance of Irish ministers and Irish departments. There are another 650 Irish nationals working inside the Commission, the Parliament and the Council. Indeed, I am delighted that perhaps our most eminent Irish official ever to serve in Europe, Catherine Day, is with us this evening. And I suspect will give us the benefit of some of her wisdom too, because you won't have to listen to me alone all night. The treaties oblige the European institutions to maintain an open, transparent and regular dialogue with representatives, societies, and in particular civil society. And the same treaties have provisions for citizens' initiatives, giving citizens the right to submit proposals on new legislation. So let's nail this lie that the European Union is not democratic. I can think of no piece of European legislation that has not, in the making, passed through the hands and scrutiny of an Irish Commissioner, Irish ministers, Irish parliamentarians, and indeed Irish officials. In fact, in some cases, the legislation has been written by them. The European Union is not perfect, though, and we shouldn't pretend that it is. That's why the process to focus on the future of Europe is so important. We need to design an improved future for this project that continues to grow and expand. Since we're in a law school, let me quote from an editorial in the Common Market Law Review. It says there seems to be a gap between the area of human hope as contemplated and constructed by EU law and the world as perceived by citizens. The language and appearances of emancipation exist, but the EU seems unable to create the background conditions to make it real. It would be wrong to ignore the sense of disconnect between citizens on the one hand and institutions and processes on the other. And that is why this Future of Europe debate cannot be about institutional structural change and how the mechanics of that work. That might be interesting for the people who work there, but it's largely irrelevant in terms of the consciousness of many people at home. Despite efforts such as the Blue Star programme, for example, which is an initiative that tries to foster a better understanding of Europe in primary schools, and there are many other examples of projects like that, there is still a feeling that the European Union is remote on the one hand and interfering on the other, depending on where you come from. This is why the government has launched its Future of Europe initiative, And it's why we're looking for your ideas and your views to challenge us. That's why we want you to engage in the citizens' dialogue, led by Helen McEntee, Minister of State for European Affairs, and why I'm here this evening to share some of my own thoughts with you on some of the issues that are relevant. A number of ideas have been put forward to reform the institutions. One of the ideas is that the President of the European Commission and the President of the European Council could be one and the same person. I'm not convinced that this would bring the institutions closer to citizens. However, we should have an open mind about ideas like transnational lists for candidates for European elections. If this helps bring Europe and citizens closer to one another, well, then I think we need to be open to it. Throughout its history, the European Union has never stood still. It began as a peace project focused on neutralizing the instruments of war. It became a common market. When it found its international voice, it gave itself a common foreign and security policy. In the 80s and 90s, it set itself a goal of completing an internal market. Then the single currency was adopted because currency fluctuations threatened the operation of the internal market. The EU has never stood still, and it shouldn't start now. Standing still is never smart, and in the face of Brexit, standing still is simply not a viable option, in particular for Ireland, or for the UK for that matter, because our relationship will remain strong despite Brexit. There is going to be a Brexit gap in the EU's budget after the UK leaves. It could be in the region of 12 to 15 billion euros per annum. To put that into context, 12 billion is equivalent to the EU's entire foreign budget, namely all of the resources the EU spends on development cooperation, humanitarian assistance, migration and security. Or to put it another way, 12 billion is about 20% of the Common Agricultural Policy budget each year. The axe will not, of course, fall in just one area, but I think those figures give you a sense of the scale of what's going to be missing. And it's not just a money thing. The influence of Britain, which has been a massively positive one in my view, in the European Union, particularly on issues like the common market and free and fair trade and an approach towards globalization, is also going to be missed in the future. So as I've said, standing still is just not on. Europe needs momentum, not stagnation. The European Union makes progress on the basis, in some ways, of classic policy research. Leaders and officials addressing issues and finding solutions. Sometimes it's been driven into making breakthroughs in the heat of a crisis, and we've seen some of that in the last decade. But it has been at its best when it's been carried forward by men and women with a grand vision, big ambitions, and even bigger ideas. Let me just address some of those ideas now that I think we have probably addressed some of the lies that sometimes are sold about the European Union in terms of it being undemocratic, in terms of involving a loss of sovereignty, in terms of this idea that Ireland may have no friends in the future, or that we should simply just sit still and take a safe option in the future because consolidation is what the European Union should be about rather than actually ambition and expansion. Membership has been central to the transformation of Ireland's economy. As a trading nation, we depend on international rules which permit the free flow of goods, services and capital. The most important of these are the rules governing the EU single market. Since the financial crisis, the focus has been on the steps needed to complete economic and monetary union. Now is not the moment to get lost in technical detail, except to say that we need to complete banking union. If the single currency is to function as it should, it must be as safe to deposit funds in an Irish bank as it is to do so in, say, a German bank or an Italian bank or a Greek bank. We cannot witness again a retreat of cash from so-called peripheral countries to so-called core countries. We've seen the chaos that that causes. Equally, in the age of high debt and low investment, we must complete the capital markets union. At the outset of the financial crisis, banks were providing 70% finance to businesses in Europe, but the comparable figure in the US was just 20%. The Capital Markets Union would allow businesses in Europe access to other lines of finance, boosting investment and creating jobs. Completing the Banking Union and the Capital Markets Union are priorities right now, but the historical reality is that imbalances can build up in currency areas and can give rise to vulnerabilities wherever asymmetric shocks occur. In the longer term perspective, we need to be ready to engage in fuller reforms of the single currency to enhance democratic accountability and the governance of economic and monetary union. The German Chancellor, Willy Brandt, proposed economic and monetary union as early as 1969. When European leaders finally asked Jacques Delors to develop a new plan for economic and monetary union in 1988, this was part of a wider effort to complete the single market. Currency movements were disrupting the operation of the market, and exchange rate variability was complicating the administration of payments under the Common Agricultural Policy, for example, but also in lots of other areas too. Back in 1957, when the EU's founding treaty, the Treaty of Rome, was signed, a priority was given to balancing trade and fair competition, eliminating barriers, and the abolition of restrictions on international trade. But 60 years on, the priorities laid out in the Treaty of Rome are still far from fulfilled. We've made great progress in opening up the internal market in trade and in goods, but not in services. It is difficult to measure progress in these areas, but some say we have succeeded in completing 80% of the internal market for goods, but only made 40% of the progress we need in terms of completing the internal market for services. Back in 2010, Mario Monti advised the European Commission that deepening the internal market would be a critical part of Europe's response to the crisis. At the time, trade and services accounted for 70% of Europe's GDP, but only 20% of services had a cross-border dimension. Just last week, the European Commission asked member states to achieve significant progress towards completing the single market. It is time certain member states stopped dragging the Commission's heels in relation to this issue. So the first new idea to complete the internal market, especially the internal market in services, is not a new idea at all. But we need to put this back on the political agenda, and where better to do so than at UCD's School of Law, named after Peter Sutherland, the former Commissioner for Competition Policy and former Director General of the World Trade Organization. In Ireland, the services sector employs just over half of our workforce and accounts for more than half of our exports. As an island nation, we never have enough demand in the domestic market for our own goods or for our own services, so we export most of our production. In losing the UK, the European Union is about to lose a member state that was one of the biggest supporters of continuing to develop the internal market. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the United Kingdom was the chief architect of the current single market that we all benefit from today. As a consequence, Irish exporters will have to engage seriously in market diversification, and we will have to advocate all the more vocally for competing in and completing the internal market, in particular for services. The Jacques Delors Institute has argued that sheltering service sectors from competition hampers the proper functioning of the single market, perpetuating the disruptions that the single currency was meant to ease. Protectionism does not protect, but it can be deeply embedded. I'm reminded of a petition by French candle makers who complained in the 19th century that they were subjected to intolerable competition from a foreign rival whose superior facilities for producing light enables him to flood the French market at so low a price as to take away all our customers the moment he appears, suddenly reducing an important branch of French industry to stagnation. It was somewhat tongue-in-cheek, as it turned out that the intolerable foreign rival was in fact the sun. But that was the past. In the future, participation in the workforce will depend less on where people live and more on the speed of their internet connection. In recognition of this, the European Union has set itself a realistic target of completing the digital single market by the end of next year. But we must go further. So tonight, a full 60 years after the Treaty of Rome, I'm calling for an ambitious target to complete the internal market for services by 2022, in 5 years' time. This would honour a commitment originally made in 1957. At a time when we are urging the UK to stay in the single market, I'm simply asking that we complete it. And shining a light on the protectionists, we will boost jobs and growth in Ireland and also across the European Union as a whole. The European Commission reckons it would add almost 2% or nearly 300 billion euros to the EU's GDP. A European Parliament report says the benefit could be over 600 billion. In the 1990s, efforts to complete the internal market in goods coincided with a period of unprecedented growth. Putting the same effort into completing the market in services will give Europe the momentum, in my view, our economy needs. A more competitive and efficient professional services sector would help industrial competitiveness and the European economy as a whole. Competition in financial services, leading to cheaper mortgages and cheaper insurance, would enjoy the support, in my view, of Irish consumers very, very strongly. Of course, the internal market is not the only market. Ireland is an enthusiastic supporter of efforts to open up new markets to European exporters. I spent Friday at the Eastern Partnership Summit working with our neighbours, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, Moldova and Ukraine, to develop stronger, diversified and vibrant economies across the broader region. A new European trade deal with Canada has just come into effect on a provisional basis. This is partly why I'm opening a new consulate in Vancouver next year. Deals with Japan, Mexico and Mercosur countries are in the pipeline. And the EU hopes to open trade negotiations with Australia and New Zealand. Our decision to open a new embassy in New Zealand is a measure of our commitment to this trade agenda. So too is the announcement of new embassies in Chile and Colombia, Santiago and Bogota, and Jordan, and a new consulate, which effectively will be a trade consulate in Mumbai. But we're not naive. We will expect reciprocity in the give and take of trade negotiations, and you can be assured that we will insist on the highest social, environmental, data protection and food safety standards in each of these deals. This is what makes the European Union different to most other parts of the world. Lately, we have witnessed a retreat from the values-based diplomacy among certain superpowers. An ugly, protectionist, transactional approach to international relations is emerging, and we need to call it what it is. Left unchallenged, it will deliver quick bucks, perhaps, for the elite, but long-term devastating consequences, in my view, for the masses. The European Union needs to find its voice, but many around the world are straining to hear it. It has to be able to speak truth to power and louder. Let's be very clear. We can't tweet our way through the problems that the world faces today. When I spoke at the UN General Assembly in New York in September, I said that with Ireland, you know what you get. A small state with big thinking, a country that listens, a strong independent voice that promotes values, and a country that inspires others, I hope. The European Union is a union of medium to small-sized countries like Ireland, and we have a shared European interest in facing the world together. As the Union's global strategy points out, we can, through our combined weight, promote agreed rules to contain power politics and contribute to a peaceful, fair and prosperous world. My second proposal for tonight, therefore, is for the EU to set itself a new goal, to have a common foreign policy that is as effective and ambitious as its international trade policy. The EU needs to find its voice and become a diplomatic superpower. That is what we should be. We must work harder to do what we have already said we would do, namely to promote a rules-based global order with multilateralism as its key principle and the United Nations at its core. The case for this was made eloquently in the global strategy when it argued that a rules-based global order unlocks the full potential of a prosperous union with open economies and deep global connections and embeds democratic values within an international system. Now we must do it, not just say it. The European Union is committed to promoting peace, prosperity, democracy and the rule of law. In order to achieve these objectives, the Union's strategies include support for global governance and support for cooperative regional orders. I want Ireland to play a leading role in Europe in helping to build better and more effective political partnerships with Africa in particular, rooted in shared interests, shared values, and on a partnership basis. When I visited the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa earlier this month, I argued for a new political architecture for relations between the European Union and Africa, one that matches the urgency of the shared challenges we face. It is simply not good enough to have an EU-Africa summit once every 3 or 4 years and to expect that level of high political engagement to be enough in the context of the challenges that two continents, that are neighbouring continents, face together. 21 billion euros in development aid was provided to Africa last year by the EU and its member states, making us the largest aid donors on the continent. A further 32 billion was invested in Africa by EU companies in 2015, accounting for 1/3 of the foreign direct investment in Africa. But collectively, we can do much, much more than that. 60% of Africa's population is now under the age of 25. By comparison, the average age in Europe is heading towards 45 within the next 10 years. Our population over the age of 65 in Ireland is going to double over the next 20 years. And we have the youngest population in the European Union. The EU-Africa Summit opens in Abidjan tomorrow, and the theme there will be investing in Africa's youth, and the Taoiseach would be there if it wasn't for the political issues that he's had to deal with this week. Despite our aid and investment, Europe is still only spending 230 million a year on education programs in Africa. This needs to change if we're serious about transforming Africa's demographic challenge into an opportunity, which I believe it can be. All too often we've seen our collective investments and the futures of young Africans jeopardized by poor governance arrangements or conflict. I look, for example, at what the people of Zimbabwe have had to endure in recent decades. Only 8 member states of the African Union have not experienced armed conflict since independence, and evidence suggests a higher instance of conflict in countries with lower per capita incomes, lower life expectancy, and meagre economic opportunities. You don't need me to tell you that. Often the argument is made that economic progress is a precondition for political progress. I do not buy that argument. If anything, the danger now is that some see economic progress as a substitute for political progress, and we should certainly not buy that either. Since the EU is a values-based organisation and is both the biggest donor and investor in Africa, we have an opportunity to help build resilient and accountable states which will deliver for their youthful populations. Resilient states are states with strong democracies and high levels of trust in institutions. Our focus should be on building resilience, that in states that are ready to work with us on reform and on the rules-based global order that we need. To make that happen, we need to build a scenario after this week's summit that puts structures in place to facilitate closer political engagement at a very senior level between the European Union and Africa. We need a political partnership of equals for the gravity of the shared challenges that we face. And just to put that into context, I visited Ethiopia and Kenya on the same trip that I referred to earlier. In Ethiopia alone, in order to keep pace with population growth in terms of young people becoming of working age, they will need to create 2 million jobs a year, every year, indefinitely into the future, in one country alone. In their neighbour, in Kenya, they need to create 1 million jobs a year. Now, Ireland, with all of the work that we've tried to do on job creation over the last 5 years, has managed to create 230,000 extra jobs in Ireland. We're talking about achieving the impossible here. Unless we can create the partnerships and the dynamism and the investment that Europe can provide to help countries cope with this extraordinary population explosion, along with a hugely ambitious growing young population that can actually be a huge driver for growth and expansion as opposed to a source of conflict and frustration and division, which is of course what it will become if we can't respond together. In terms of some of the other challenges, they include the migration challenge, for example. We can be proud, of course, of the 17,500 lives saved by our naval service in the Mediterranean. But should it have come to this? Our approach to migration has tended to be short-term and reactionary, but it needs to be long-term and strategic so that we can turn the demographic challenge into a demographic opportunity. The European Union is struggling to deal with hundreds of thousands of refugees crossing the Mediterranean. A country like Ethiopia alone has had to deal with about 1 million refugees coming into one country from neighbouring conflicts like South Sudan and Somalia. If the European Union is to take an integrated approach to conflicts and crises, it needs to develop the means and the capacity to do so. This is a sensitive issue, particularly in Ireland, but one that we cannot shy away from, and it brings us back to the issue of sovereignty. Our neutrality began under Eamon de Valera as an outward and visible sign of our sovereignty and indeed our independence. It did not follow any political doctrine, and in 1961 it was all but abandoned by the Lamass government in pursuit of EEC membership. Sean Lamass said, "We are not neutral and do not wish to be regarded as such." Later in 1969, Jack Lynch said, "We have never been ideologically neutral." You might note I'm not quoting Fine Gael, Taoiseach, just in case people think I'm in any way biased. But the Irish people have become immensely attached to our military neutrality, and that's true. As a consequence, we have adopted a triple lock system which requires a UN mandate, a government decision, and Dáil approval before we deploy troops abroad. Our legally binding Lisbon Protocol expressly confirms that the Treaty of Lisbon does not affect or prejudice Ireland's traditional policy of military neutrality. We have inserted a provision in the Constitution that would require a referendum if we were ever to move to a European common defence system. Our policy of military neutrality is a core element now of our foreign policy, and it will remain as so. But none of this cuts across our obligation under the UN Charter to make armed forces available in order to contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security. Indeed, since 1958, 86 members of our defence forces have given their lives on peacekeeping duty. And currently, defence forces have nearly 600 personnel deployed abroad. We can be immensely proud of them all. Early this year, the Taoiseach summed up our policy when he said, "Ireland's position on neutrality is long-standing. We believe that by being a country that is neutral, but not being part of any military alliance, that it actually makes us stronger in the world and we're more respected. Our focus is on other things like development, for example. Having said that, cooperation around security and defence is changing. The threats that we face in the world are less about wars between countries now and more about threats created by terrorism, by extremism, by cyber attacks, and those areas are not areas in which we should be neutral. Despite our attachment to military neutrality, 57% of respondents in a recent opinion poll agreed that Ireland should be part of increased EU defence and security cooperation. This, I believe, is because our military neutrality is not and should not be an end in itself. The objective is to protect our people and defend our territory. Our military neutrality only makes sense if and when it makes us safer. The threat identified by the Taoiseach, terrorism, extremism and cyber attacks, are asymmetric threats. We cannot face them alone, and cooperation with our EU partners will make us safer in the face of many of these challenges. The boundaries between internal and external security are becoming blurred. Cybercrime and terrorist use of the internet are growing. Climate change, demographics and fragility are driving conflict and creating stability, particularly in our neighbourhood. The mood across the Union at the moment is that Europe needs to do more to promote peace and take care of its own security needs. Last week, the government agreed that we would recommend membership of the EU's permanent structured cooperation to Dáil Éireann. The EU relies on assets, civilian and military, provided by member states to undertake international peace support missions to prevent and resolve conflict in support of the United Nations. PESCO, as it's known, provides a mechanism to meet an identified need for closer cooperation between partners to ensure the availability of military capabilities required for these purposes and ensure that Irish defence personnel serving in future EU missions will be well prepared and equipped, as indeed they should be. And as a former Minister for Defence, having visited many Irish troops on missions abroad, the core issue here is that they are prepared, they're trained properly, their equipment works, and that they have trained with the soldiers alongside them from other countries, largely EU countries. And the new structures will facilitate more of that. Membership of PESCO is voluntary, though, and does not change in any way the triple lock that remains in place before we deploy troops abroad. I'm confident that Dáil Éireann will recognise this and give this new initiative its approval. The countries of the Western Balkans are already working with the European Union as security providers, and some of them have been working with the European Union, helping to cope with the flow of migrants from the Syrian crisis, for example. None of the countries of the Western Balkans are keen to enjoy the collective, now the countries of the Western Balkans are keen to enjoy the collective security that we, as member states, certainly enjoy. The EU is clear that a credible enlargement process is a key component of the EU's foreign policy. In March, the European Council reaffirmed its unequivocal support for the European perspective of the Western Balkans. But hidden beneath these statements, the reality is that enlargement fatigue has set in certain quarters. The other reality, however, is that there has hardly been a moment in the EU's history when it hasn't been engaged in enlargement discussions of one kind or another. And as I said earlier, the European Union can never stand still. The prospect of accession has already contributed to peace in the Western Balkans, and public support for EU membership remains high. Earlier, I described what it felt like for us to be dismissed as remote, underdeveloped, and not taken seriously, and how 40 years of membership has turned all of that on its head on this island. Ireland understands the transformative power of membership of this union. Now that we enjoy the benefits of membership, it would be short-sighted indeed to pull up the drawbridge and deny the same opportunity to others. New members of the single market mean new markets for Irish exports, if you want to look at it selfishly, not that I think we should. but it makes sense on all accounts. The EU has already the biggest trading partner and is already the biggest trading partner and the biggest investor in the Western Balkans. It is a region of immense strategic importance, and countries such as Russia and China are competing for influence there. The European Union is due to hold a summit with the countries of the Western Balkans in May. The month of May is known as Białtynna in the Irish language. And on the occasion of the last big wave of accession, Seamus Heaney, who many of you will know, wrote a wonderful poem which he called Beacons at Białtynna. At the summit in May, we should think of the people of the Western Balkans, and perhaps these lines from Seamus Heaney. So on a day when newcomers appear, let it be a homecoming, and let us speak the unstrange word, as it behoves us here, move lips, move minds, and make new meanings flare, like ancient beacons signalling peak to peak, from Middle Sea to North Sea, shining clear as phoenix flame upon Fionishka here. The European Union puts itself on the line every time it enlarges. Yes, there's risk. Yes, it makes management more complicated. But as I've explained earlier, Europe must always have momentum and must always have a direction that it is traveling in. Today, an applicant country is required to guarantee democracy, the rule of law, respect for and protection for minorities, the existence of a functioning market economy, and the capacity to take on the obligations of membership. These are issues that should be settled, of course, before a country joins, not afterwards. So if the countries of the Western Balkans meet these criteria, if, in other words, they mean business, then we should mean business too. Just as we should shine a light on the protectionists, come next May, we should be ready to send a beacon of hope at the summit to the candidate countries. If they indicate that they are in earnest, if they indicate that they are in earnest when they say that they want to join. My vision for Europe is an ambitious one. It will require the funds to do things that matter, like, for example, maintaining the common agricultural policy, regional funds, investing in research and support for successive programs such as Erasmus. But we also need resources for new challenges such as environmental protection, climate change, which I believe the European Union should be a global leader on, and indeed Ireland needs to do more in this area. Migration and security, which I've already spoken about. Doing more in Africa and a new round of enlargement will have resource implications. Of course, completion of the internal market would go some way towards creating the revenue to cover those additional costs. But I've already explained how difficult it'll be to maintain existing levels of spending because of the likely Brexit funding gap. Discussions on the EU budget, the multi-annual financial framework, have already begun. For the first time, we will be entering these negotiations as a net contributor to the EU budget. For every 50 euros Europeans, citizens pay in taxes and social contributions, just €1 goes towards funding the EU budget. We will continue to have huge interests in a substantial and sustainable common agricultural policy. We have benefited enormously from structural and cohesion funds, and these programs will continue to play a crucial role in reducing economic and social disparities across the European Union, which of course will be so important in the context of future enlargement. We have other priorities too. The Erasmus programme has been a real success story, and I'm sure that many of you here have been on Erasmus year in another university. Perhaps some of you have families as a result of that now. The Horizon 2020 programme provides not only funding for research and development, but also helps foster European-wide partnerships and excellence in academic scientific research. Our aim must be to agree a financial framework that allows for investment in areas that yield real added value and serve European interests overall. And we're going to have to ask ourselves some hard questions here, because this is a zero-sum game. We can't spend more without increasing budgets. And we are facing a net loss in the context of losing a big partner in the UK and big contributor to those budgets. So we're going to have to face choices. If Europe wants an ambitious approach towards many of the things that we're talking about here, that costs money. And we'll have to ask ourselves the question how Europe is funded in the future and what Ireland is willing to contribute towards that debate and towards that budget. The Citizens' Dialogue, which we have launched on the future of Europe, is intended to help answer some of these questions. I hope that at the very least, the ideas that I'm putting forward tonight will help prompt some discussion on the Europe that we want. It is your Europe. It's your future, and I really would encourage you to get involved. So thank you very much for taking the time to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Minister, thank you very much indeed. That was a very wide-ranging and very thought-provoking speech. I admire the way that you addressed the internal EU agenda, the completing the internal market, then you moved externally to Africa, all the challenges of Europe's role in the wider world, and then the in-betweeners when you talked about those who aspire to move from outside to inside the European Union. So plenty of food for thought there and a very wide range of ideas. I'm going to invite people in the audience to put questions or comments to the Minister in a moment. And if you would just say who you are and whether you're a student or whether you represent an organisation, that would be very helpful. But Minister, just to kick off the question and answer session, we are here in university, we have quite a number of students in the audience. Why would you say to younger people that they should now get involved in this debate? What's their role in shaping the future of the EU?
Well, I mean, what I'd say is that don't let somebody else design your future for you. And there is a real risk that that could happen here. That a relatively small section of society will make these decisions through EU institutions and influencing those institutions. And that we'll find in a few years' time that people will rightly be asking questions, well, who made that call? Why are we taking that direction? Why are we investing in the Middle East or Africa? Or why are we looking at a more ambitious approach towards enlargement? Or did somebody not raise the issue of how we can collectively combat extremism and terrorism? Like, these are issues that are going to impact on your lives. And you should be involved in those decisions. Ireland is so immersed in the future of the European Union. We're so reliant on that future in terms of our own security, our own economy, and the freedoms and privileges that we as a developed country enjoy. And so the idea that actually we would allow somebody else, maybe not even in Ireland, to be giving an Irish perspective is really, I think, a missed opportunity that we can't allow to happen. So that's why I think people need to have their say, and they need to be pretty blunt about it in terms of what they want. And it's up to people like me and others to listen to that and to factor that into the response that the Irish government gives, first of all, to that engagement, but more importantly, the contribution that the Irish government then makes to the overall Future Europe debate, which is really taking place over the next 12 months.
Thank you very much. Now, the lights are shining right in my eyes, so it's going to be hard to see people more than about 4 rows in, but so wave. Who would like to break the ice and put the first question or comment to the Minister? Yes, please. We'll
Ray Atkinson from Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute.
We'll just get a microphone to you.
There's a mic in the way there, Ray, sorry. I can hear you, but I'm not sure the people behind you can.
Thank you very much. Ray Atkinson, Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute in Northern Ireland. Quite separate from anything to do with AFBI. I was interested in your comments about the common foreign policy of Europe. Do you stop short, Minister, at a European army?
I do, yeah. I mean, I think that What PESCO provides for now on a voluntary basis is for countries to work together where they have mutual interest in terms of security and defence issues. So from an Irish perspective, we will certainly volunteer in areas maybe like marine surveillance, certainly peacekeeping, maybe some of the projects that are already there in the context of the Med. You'll certainly see Ireland looking to be part of partnerships around cybersecurity, I suspect, in the future. So the beauty of the PESCO structure is that you can essentially opt in and opt out to different projects where you can add value and where it's important to you. Where I think Irish people would be uncomfortable is if we suggested that we would try to create this common defence force across the European Union in some kind of classic military sense. I don't believe that will happen. In some ways, that's what NATO does anyway, where you have tight cooperation between NATO member states on defence issues. And countries like Ireland and others have chosen not to be part of that. And of course, that is, within our constitution as well, in terms of the military neutrality issue that I discussed earlier. That doesn't mean that we don't work with NATO on certain things. I mean, we have worked with NATO, for example, in Afghanistan quite effectively because we had a specific expertise that we could offer there in terms of demining programs. So we'll continue to work in partnership with different structures and organizations. But the key thing is that will be on a voluntary basis. So countries like Ireland will decide where they send their defence force personnel. So that's the approach that I would be advocating.
Hello, I'm Mary Catherine Lucy from the Law School. Minister, I was very struck by you exhorting us to think of Africa, and I think you're right. I think we look far too much internally. And you're also talking about competition and competition law and how that has benefited us in Europe. And this got me thinking when you mentioned the need for high-level political engagement between European politicians, I presume, and Africans. But I'd urge you, Minister, not to forget the agencies. And I think that we in Europe have a very well-established network of agencies, and I'm thinking now of competition agencies. We have the European Competition Network, and every member state has a member on it. Now, it then became part of an informal organisation called the International Competition Network. And now I'm getting into the competition part of that. When there's a cartel in Africa, it affects the price of bread. This is very important for people. Yet the competition agencies perhaps don't have the expertise or have the knowledge. Fledgling agencies often aren't resourced. They can learn from their neighbours. And this is what I would like you to consider, Minister, the role that we could have in Europe in exporting or helping other agencies with our well-established agencies. And I'm sure there's scope for environmental agencies, etc., etc. That's not to knock the good work of high-level politicians. And thank you very much for your speech.
Yeah, no, I mean, what I mean by high-level political structures is that there's a need for a decision-making process that then results in the triggering of the other levels of cooperation that need to happen as a result of that. But if that's not decided upon at a high political level, well, then it just doesn't happen. And the reason why I feel so strongly about the relationship between the EU and Africa is that we are talking about in the next 25 years the continent of Africa having an extra billion people. Like that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about at the moment. I think my figures might be a year or two out of date, but they're roughly right. The value of Africa's agricultural harvest is about 300 billion euros, and what it will need to be to feed that extra billion people. Will in 25 years' time is about 1.3 trillion. So like we're talking about just this incredible growth story without the capacity to really deliver on it in a way that avoids what I would regard as chaos. And we're already seeing the fallout of some of that at the moment in terms of lots and lots of young people unable to get employment, forced into migration. About 6 or 7 million people at any given moment in time are on the move on that continent, mostly within countries and between African countries, some of them trying to come to the European Union, but small numbers in relative terms. So, we have a choice to make here. We either ignore this largely and see Africa as a place where we need to give development aid funds, which is important in terms of sort of humanitarian intervention. But we essentially try to increase the defence structures of the European Union to protect against mass migration and people trafficking and so on. Or we actually say, look, the European Union is Africa's closest neighbour. We need to immerse ourselves in these challenges in partnership with African countries that are willing to do that with us and want to do that with us, to help them challenge and solve these problems. I mean, you know, UCD has a fantastic Department of Agriculture and Food here in terms of food technologies and so on. Many of the research programs that we have invested in here could be hugely valuable in the context of many of the challenges that are faced. You know, there are many crops in Africa that not only, I mean, let me just give you potatoes as a good example. We had a long conversation with the now president of Kenya, again, as of today, about the potato crop in Kenya. You know, they're averaging yields of somewhere between 5 and 7 tons per hectare. In Ireland, we're averaging 70 tons per hectare, 10 times. And not only that, but about half, sometimes more than half of the crop is lost after harvest because they have no facilities to store properly. So, you know, there are interventions that we can make in partnership that are about building capacity, knowledge, and the ability to be able to develop at the pace that undoubtedly many of these countries are going to have to try and develop at. And for me, what is needed is intense political engagement on quite a regular basis. I believe we should actually be designing new political institutions to deal with the relationship between Europe and Africa, and that we should structure that political engagement that can allow for decision-making that goes way beyond aid and private sector investment looking for opportunities, but is actually about a much deeper partnership in terms of dealing with the extraordinary challenges, but also the extraordinary opportunities that are there. I think in the absence of that, we're going to be dealing with a lot more conflict and a lot more misery. And whether Europe likes it or not, that misery is going to come to us because people will travel. So.
The microphone to come down over here. Maybe could you just very briefly develop on that thought, because there's often at the moment in the media a kind of juxtaposition between Chinese development support to Africa, which is seen as being without strings attached, and European, which has, as you briefly hinted in your speech, is sometimes seen to have too many strings attached. How can we develop a new approach that takes the positive values of Europe to Africa, but isn't seen as us lecturing others?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the challenges that Europe faces. You know, when you speak to African leaders, particularly off the record, they will talk about some of the hang-ups that they understandably have in relation to the treatment that they feel they've got from senior European politicians at different times, which is sometimes patronising, and there's a kickback against that. And when they have options in terms of funding coming from China, coming from Russia, where there's no strings attached, where it's just a commercial deal, and there's no need for the political engagement that comes with that, well, then that's an attractive proposition. You know, and if you travel around Addis today, you know, you will see Chinese signs all over new building projects, roads, buildings, government departments, you know, and now there's also some EU-funded projects too. Don't get me wrong, but for me, and you know, one of the focal points of the EU-Africa Summit tomorrow will be a new initiative by the European Investment Bank, which is a major funding initiative for projects in Africa, which is welcome on one level. But for me, that kind of misses the point. What's required here is for Africa to see Europe as a partner in development. And that goes, you know, that should be about helping a country to put institutions in place, judicial systems in place, as well as bringing technology that can allow economies to grow and expand, as well as benefiting from the mistakes as well as the successes that Europe has had in terms of political developments, transparency, functioning democracies, and all the other things that effectively many countries on this continent will have to find a way of doing in 20 years what it's taken us 80 or 90 years in the European Union to do. And we still aren't doing it too well, as we've seen in the last 2 weeks in terms of our own institutions of the state, sometimes. I think less of the lecturing, less of the patronizing language, and a lot more robust, direct, honest engagement that can create what I regard as a necessity for a new political partnership between the EU and Africa. In the absence of that, in my view, we will be forced to engage, but it'll be on the basis of responding to crises.
Thank you very much. Now we have some questions from
Andrew Ralph, student here in UCD. Thank you very much for your speech, Minister. And I just want to pick up on something that you said about you were debunking the myth that we're not going to have friends when Britain leaves. On the issue of corporation tax and how the 12.5% is so important to the Irish economy, especially when attracting foreign direct investment. What alliances can we build to try and prevent what many perceive as a move towards harmonised corporation tax, which would be detrimental to Irish economic interests? I mean, it's a testament to Irish diplomacy that the Irish issues are in the top 3 in phase 1 of the negotiations, and obviously that goes to show that Irish diplomacy has been very effective here in Brexit, but can Irish diplomacy be as effective in saving our corporation tax?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's important to put this into context, because some people talk about Ireland like we have the lowest corporate tax in the world. Like, we're nowhere near the lowest. That's the first thing. Within the OECD, about a third of the countries in the OECD actually have a lower corporate tax rate than Ireland. But we have a very competitive tax rate, that is true. And yes, there are powerful countries in the European Union who would like to see a move towards a common corporate tax base and, in time, a common corporate tax rate. And Ireland doesn't want that. We believe that economies should have the flexibility in terms of economic management from domestic governments to be able to have tools that they can use to drive competitiveness and job creation and support international investment and so on, which is what Ireland has done very successfully for the last 3 or 4 decades. But I mean, look, we're losing a great ally in Britain. Often when this issue came up, Britain simply just batted it away because they had the scale to be able to do it. And so Britain has been a great ally on this issue. Not that they want to necessarily reduce their own corporate tax rate down to Ireland's levels, but they recognise the importance of countries making their own decisions on tax. It is going to be the case of losing a very significant and powerful ally on these issues. But there are plenty of other countries in the European Union who share Ireland's view. And I think you will see Ireland creating more formalised political alliances with Nordic countries, for example, with Baltic states, with Benelux countries, and we'll form alliances with other countries on other issues too. Ireland and France, for example, have a lot in common on agriculture. We have, so depending on the issue, that determines the alliances. But I mean, if you think about it, I mean, Ireland actually almost won the competitive process to host the European Banking Authority a few weeks ago. Like, we actually drew with France. It was actually, I was gutted that night because nobody expected us to be competitive, because Ireland is now seen by some as sort of geographically on the western edge of the European Union. And most other countries are kind of nestled into natural groupings. So you have countries in the Med that kind of stick together. You have countries, as I say, in the Benelux countries that stick together. You have Nordic countries that are naturally in a group and actually have a formalized political structural engagement there. Baltic states the same. And then you have obviously big players that other people come to, like France and Germany and Spain and Italy, because of their scale anyway. People ask me the question sometimes, like, where does Ireland fit in? in terms of those groups. And I think we proved that actually we've lots of friends when actually competing very directly with France and Germany for the EBA and beating Frankfurt as a destination in terms of votes and then drawing with France and only losing out on the drawing of lots, which you'd like to think a small country would get preferential treatment if it draws with a big country, but that didn't happen. So unfortunately, actually, that was the second week in a row that we lost to France on a key issue, and bad things tend to happen in threes, as we've seen this week. So we're due some good luck, I think. But the point I'd make is that actually Ireland has lots of friends, but we need to maintain and actually build on those friendships so that we do build alliances when there are issues that other countries legitimately want to see change on. They have a legitimate view that actually convergence in relation to tax policy might be a good thing for the European Union. We disagree, and we will argue that point. And I believe we will have sufficient support to ensure that we protect our interests there. But the poor British ambassador is used to me saying this all the time, but it would be wrong not to recognise that the European Union without the United Kingdom will be a different and a weaker place. But we can make up for that with the new alliances that we'll forge, and we will invest a lot more money in our embassies and our diplomatic missions around the European Union strategically to ensure that we do that.
Thank you very much. We had a hand over here.
Alex Evans from UCD. Thanks very much for your presentation, Minister. I really enjoyed it. I like the notion of one of the main functions of the European Union is to solve challenges that countries can't solve or even tackle themselves. But, with the words "get involved" behind you, I think the challenge is to get the individual European citizen to buy into the need to solve those challenges. Yeah. So with, the average voter really concerned about what happens in their parish, trying to get them to be concerned about these huge issues, and I would share your views on them, on most of them anyway. How do you marry those two really big challenges of getting the citizens in behind these huge challenges for this large group?
Yeah, I mean,
thank you.
I think that's a very fair question. And there are some people who would say to me, and they can be quite convincing, that look, the next 10 to 20 years for Europe should be a period of consolidation. That we've had a lot of unrest in the European Union in the last decade. We've had a financial crisis, we've had a banking collapse. In the last 20 years, we've seen dramatic enlargement. And we're still coping with trying to create a balance in the context of that. We have real external challenges now in terms of migration and Europe continuing to try and find its place in the world in terms of influence. And all that's true. And I think the easy option here is to say, well, let's focus on the quality of life of Europeans in terms of looking inwards and focus on security, focus on supporting farmers, focus on a more responsible approach towards the environment, on food safety. Let's focus on our internal market so that we can function better, and let's kind of ignore what's going on outside. And the countries that want to join, well, maybe it's more hassle than it's worth. I mean, the truth is I think we need to do both. And the European Union needs to be ambitious enough to do both. And so that we have to continue to sell to a farmer in Timoleague that actually, without the support of a single market to sell into and a common agricultural policy, which probably makes up about which funds about 60% of his profits or her profits, actually farming would be very different in Ireland. So there are practical things that people do connect to the European Union. around farming, around fishing, around not having roaming charges when you go on holidays, not requiring any visas to work, allowing your kids to go and study abroad if they want to, on structured programs. Like a lot of actually what we take for granted at the moment, particularly younger people, the idea that actually there'd be any barrier to movement, within the European Union is almost like a preposterous suggestion. Which is why I think so many people are kind of struggling to get their heads around the Brexit challenges at the moment, because they expect to hold on to all of the benefits that have just been there in their lifetimes. Yet they're trying to actually square that with some of the challenges that we face around a country leaving and the consequences and knock-on that comes with that. So I think the answer is we need to do both. I'd hate to think that the European Union would simply look in on itself, even with an ambitious agenda. And there's a danger that that could happen, particularly in the context of radicalization and terrorism and violence. If you're in France or Germany or Britain, and you have seen children blown up in concerts, and that is a traumatizing even for those great countries experience, and most European countries now, Belgium also, Spain, Italy, most Scandinavian countries, they are trying to get their heads around what is the appropriate response here in terms of respecting people's civil liberties and human rights, and at the same time the state having to intervene more to protect its citizens. And I think security has become a huge debate, and that has actually merged into the debate around migration and immigration too, and the control of borders even within the European Union. These are tricky, difficult debates. But I think the challenge around this debate is how do we actually accept that that's a big issue that needs to be dealt with, but at the same time not lose the level of international ambition that the European Union, I think, has to continue to contribute to. Because if we don't, in my view, those other defensive interests will tend to dominate political debate in the European Union. And if you're only on the defensive politically, in my view, it's only a matter of time before the general public start to ask the question, if this is all about defensive interests, where's the positivity? So I think we have to attempt to do both, to make a direct connection between people's opportunities, whether it be job opportunities, market opportunities, or quality of life issues, or whether their issue is the environment or climate change. We can do so much more within the European Union than we could do on our own, particularly a country like Ireland. But I think we also constantly need to challenge people around some of the big ideas that I think will light a fire under the European Union and excite people. And without that, I think the project tends to stagnate.
Well, if I may, I think, Minister, that's exactly what we need, is people like yourself who see the bigger picture and who can explain it without the jargon and without the technicality, because that's often what kills the European Union in terms of general public support. It sounds boring. And in fact, what we need is people like yourself to bring it to life and to set the ambition and to get people enthused about it again. We have somebody over here who wants to come in on the discussion.
Hi, Minister. My name is Killian Down. I'm a politics student here, and thank you for your speech.
Okay.
The UK just made an offer of €100 billion as regards the settlement with the EU. Do you think this gives the UK greater leverage in trying to influence the EU in agreeing sufficient progress is made without giving any written commitments as regards Northern Ireland? And if so, will it carry any weight in this regard?
All right. If they made an offer for 100 billion, that's news to me. It's a fairly big offer, but I take the point. My understanding is that there is good progress being made on the financial settlement issues. There's also good progress being made on the citizens' rights issues, and there has been a lot of progress made on the Irish issues too, in the context of common travel area and figuring our way through the detail of the Good Friday Agreement, and in particular North-South cooperation and so on, in the context of Northern Ireland leaving the European Union. But there is a core issue here for us that we have, I think, been very consistent on, certainly since the middle of the summer, and that is that we have to provide some more reassurance than we currently have in the context of what a border might look like in the future on the island of Ireland. This is very emotive stuff for Irish people. The relationship north and south, the trading environment that people have actually got used to in terms of the normalization of the movement of goods, services, people. You know, I often give the examples from agriculture. You know, there's 100,000 store cattle from the west of Ireland, you know, go north of the border to be finished on farms in Northern Ireland. 500,000 lambs produced on Northern Ireland farms are brought south of the border to be slaughtered each year. 40% of milk on farms in Northern Ireland is actually processed south of the border. This is a sort of a normal all-island functioning market that has been a fantastic byproduct of the peace process and is very much linked to North-South cooperation under the structures of the Good Friday Agreement. And what we're saying is, look, you know, Britain and Ireland have worked really well together to create this normality. And we've got to protect it. We cannot see the re-emergence of barriers on the island of Ireland again, either barriers to trade or barriers to movement. And I believe that the British government is with us on that. We don't want to see that, and clearly the statements that have been made by the Prime Minister in particular have been very welcome in terms of the aspirations of what she's trying to achieve. The problem is, at the moment, in my view, we don't have in writing, or verbally for that matter, a description of actually how we're going to get there. And we're not asking for the minutiae of that in terms of how it's going to work. But we are asking for, as a measure of sufficient progress, the parameters within which we will be able to devise a solution for the uniqueness of the island of Ireland and the two jurisdictions on it to prevent the re-emergence of a hard border. And I don't think that's an unreasonable request, given how important that is in the context of Irish history. And that is why we've been firm on this, and I hope we've been fair too. And I think the British government gets it. And the negotiating teams are negotiating and talking about possible wording options and so on in terms of how we could provide the reassurance that's needed to allow us to move on to phase two, where ultimately we will get, hopefully, a much more complete picture in terms of how we solve these problems. But I think we can't accept moving to phase two as some kind of leap into the dark, hoping we'll be able to solve it. I think there needs to be a lot more credibility and clarity around how it would be solved and within what parameters. You know, as I say, that is why that's why the Irish government is, you know, has taken the position that it has, and we have lots of solidarity with other European member states who understand why Ireland sees itself as so vulnerable and so exposed here, and why we need more reassurance than we currently have. So, you know, the financial settlement issue is great. If we get that off the table, you know, I don't want to be lecturing anybody on that. You know, my issues are the Irish issues, and we're working very closely with the Barnier Task Force to try and make progress with the British negotiating team in those areas.
Thank you very much. We have a question over here, and then maybe we'll see who else would like to take the floor afterwards.
Sorry,
okay, please go ahead.
You're just under the light, so it's hard to see you.
Hi, Minister. My name is Joe Smith. I'm a master's student here in the law school.
Hi, Joe.
I don't see a way of avoiding a hard border. I don't think that you can leave Northern Ireland in the single market while taking the UK out. I don't think it's compatible under the Good Friday Agreement. What is in place, like I'm from Cavan. I happen to be home this weekend. My neighbour he owns a manufacturing business. He says that even the goods that don't go to the UK travel through the UK. 100% of his products go through the UK. What's in place for small businesses like my neighbours when the inevitable happens? We won't get a written guarantee, and we actually can't use our veto. It's suicidal for us.
Well, first of all, you know, this isn't going to come to a veto. So people keep talking about, will Ireland use its veto? I mean, you know, the European Union acts as one here. So, you know, Barnier and others consistently say, look, Ireland's problems are the EU's problems. We've got to solve them together. So, like, this isn't going to come down to Ireland using a veto, which is a language that, you know, the media seem to like to use. That's an attempt to try and isolate Ireland to try and break us away from the pack. And we are right in the middle of the pack here, you know, and we have lots of people around us. You know, I had the privilege of meeting probably the most senior politicians in Europe last week, Donald Tusk and Jean-Claude Juncker. I was representing Leo at an Eastern Partnership Summit, and both of them made a point of saying to me, "We will not abandon Ireland. We will not abandon Ireland." And I said, you know, thank you, because, you know, we're relying on you that you won't. And also, I think, to be fair, I don't believe that Britain wants the outcome that people fear. But perhaps we haven't quite got to a point of figuring out how we're going to prevent that. But I do not believe that, that the British government, certainly the Prime Minister, and the ministers that I've spoken to, want a hard border. They've been very clear that they don't. The only point of difference between, I think, the British government and the Irish government at this stage is that the British government is saying, look, we'll be able to solve this in phase 2 when we get into the detail of trade negotiations. And we're saying, well, sorry, we need more assurance than that. We can't just hope that that'll be the case. Now's the time to give more reassurance. So, you know, I think that, that we should avoid the impression that actually the outcome that both Britain and Ireland want is very different. Actually, it's not that different. What is different is the political process that gets us there in terms of negotiation. We want to move on to phase 2, but we are insisting on more progress on this border issue before moving to that. And you know, I hope we'll be able to find a middle ground position that both negotiating teams can live with by December, so we can move on. Otherwise, the process will be delayed, and that will create more tension. But that's where we are.
Minister, I know your day is not over and that you have to go back to Leinster House after this, so we'll take a final intervention from the back. Brief, if possible, please.
Ciaran McMullen, I'm a student here at UCD. Thanks for coming to speak to us, Minister. My question is, again, I'm afraid, on the border, and just because it's a special issue for me, just because I live 2-minute walk away from the border. The issue seems to have come to a head recently in the last couple of weeks that many ministers from both sides in Ireland and in the UK have been speaking a lot on the border. We had Theresa May saying, Prime Minister's questions the last week, that Britain will not erect border posts on the Irish border. Kate Hoey of Labour, Ireland will have to pay for a physical border with the UK. And Michel Barnier saying a moment of truth has come on the Irish border. My question would be, if God forbid, there was a hard border on this island, who would have to pay for that border? Would it be Ireland or would it be the UK? I'm afraid, for referencing Donald Trump. And secondly, if there is a fee needed to be paid by the EU, by Ireland, by the UK, would that money not be better invested in perhaps a unified Ireland for the long-term solution to the problem instead of a sticky plaster on it?
Yeah.
You don't have to expand in great detail.
No, well, look, I mean, look, I have tried not to allow this issue become a green versus orange issue in Northern Ireland. You know, and I continue to try to do that. People keep dragging me into that debate, which is, in my view, not helpful. We have got to try and find pragmatic and sensible ways in which we can protect what we have today, which is North-South cooperation that works and improves people's lives, allows people to trade with each other, and creates a normalization so that you don't even know when you're crossing the border. I mean, you know it well. Like when you drive across the border, you got to kind of, you know, be very alert to know when you're actually crossing. The only time I know is that I lose my phone coverage for about 2 minutes. And we need to keep it that way. And I can tell you the Irish government is determined that whatever happens in the context of Brexit, the one thing that we are going to protect against is the re-emergence of a border on this island. And I think that the British government hears that and also wants to respond to it. But this goes way beyond trade. You know, it's a much deeper issue politically for us. So, you know, I believe that solutions can be found. But there's also a fundamental contradiction in terms of where we are at the moment. I mean, if somebody is saying, look, we're leaving the customs union, we're leaving the single market, we're leaving the European Union, and Northern Ireland is leaving on the same terms as the rest of Britain, well then, it's pretty hard to say to people, well, if you're going to be operating in a different customs union, how are we going to avoid customs checks? If goods moving from one customs union to another require that. Whether that's infrastructure on the border or whether it's checks in people's premises or farmyards, either way, that's not acceptable from our point of view. So we do need flexible and unique solutions, is the political terminology here, reflecting the unique circumstances of the island of Ireland and the two jurisdictions on this island. And that's why we have focused on the need to avoid what's called regulatory divergence. I'm getting into kind of technical issues now, but if you have regulatory divergence because Northern Ireland leaves the European Union, you essentially operate to a different rule book in one jurisdiction versus another. And that then potentially creates problems in terms of level playing fields, in terms of how food is produced, how companies operate, how state aid rules operate. And then you create the necessity for checks if you have different standards in two different jurisdictions. There's no way of avoiding it, I don't think, which is why we have created this, which is why we have insisted on this issue being dealt with in a more comprehensive way at phase one. We need some more reassurance around the avoidance of regulatory divergence. And we can call that whatever we want. It can be a customs union partnership. It can be some trade partnership. It can be recognising sectors that currently operate on an all-island basis at the moment. And this shouldn't be a unionist versus nationalist issue in Northern Ireland. I remember when I was a Minister for Agriculture and I was chairing the Council of Ministers on Agriculture, and we were trying to get the Common Agricultural Policy completed. I travelled north of the border quite a few times to meet unionist farmers and farming organisations led by unionist farmers in the north. And they wanted to work with me on a practical basis. It kind of went against the grain, I suspect, in terms of working with a minister from Dublin who's clearly a nationalist and so on. But it was a practical approach towards ensuring that the all-island economy functioned when it came to agriculture. And a common agricultural policy would reflect the interests of farming in Northern Ireland, because it's a lot closer in many ways to farming in Ireland than maybe it is to farming in the south of England. So we can work together, and there's lots of examples of that happening. But the big danger, of course, and particularly because we have an already strained political environment in Northern Ireland without devolved government, after two very divisive and difficult elections, the tendency when you have a difficult issue like this, when you're trying to find answers for, is that people tend to revert into their own corners. And it becomes a green versus orange issue. It becomes a threat to the union, or it becomes an opportunity for United Ireland. And I think if we try to deal with Brexit in the context of Northern Ireland through that prism, it becomes all the more difficult. And so that's why we're trying to focus on practical things like avoiding regulatory divergence, avoiding two customs unions on this island, and finding a way in which there would be no need for the kind of border checks that many people fear. And I think we can do it. And I think it'll be a combination, I hope, of making sufficient progress on phase one and then trying to complete the job in terms of detail in phase two. But look, let's wait and see how that goes over the next couple of weeks.
Minister, thank you very much for giving us so much of your time this evening, for a very thought-provoking speech, lots of things to think about there, and also for your openness and availability in question time. I know UCD would love to welcome you back at some point in the future when this debate on the future of the EU has developed, and I hope that in one way or another you'll have an opportunity to engage with not only the people here but plenty of others, because this is a very important debate and you are personally very invested in it. So I'd like to wish you all the very best and thank you very much for the time that you've given us on a day that's not yet over for you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a million.